Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture of the term. So we're going to get into our Clackamas Biology 112 OpenStax textbook. And so this first chapter that we're going to go into is the Introduction to Biology. So this particular chapter, it's actually divided into 5 sections, but if you look closely, sections 1.1 and 1.3 are essentially repeats of themselves, so you can go ahead and skip section 1.3. I don't know why they have it twice. So I've broken up basically essentially 4 sections into 4 separate videos. So in this video, I'm going to cover the first section, the science of biology, okay? And then I'll cover, the next video, we'll cover the second section and so forth. Okay. So in this first video, we're going to get into the science of biology. And so by the end of this particular video, you should be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences, as well as summarize the steps of the scientific method. You should also be able to compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning and describe the goals of basic science and applied science. So it's always a good idea to write these learning objectives down, and then at the end of the videos, see if you can basically write the answers to them as a good review. Okay? So let's start out with, well, we're here for biology, so we might as well define it. Okay, so what is biology? Well, if we divide that term up, bio means life and ology means the study of. So basically we are going to spend the term studying living organisms as well as how they interact with each other and their environment. Okay, so when we take a look at living things, of course, there's a lot of life, complexity to life. And so one thing that we as biologists are always trying to figure out is the origin of life. And so we believe that the first forms of life were microorganisms, so micro meaning microscopic, cannot be seen with the naked eye, so very, very small. And in fact, if you see right here, this measurement right here, and we'll get into this week with our lab, this measurement with the weird shaped U, that stands for micro, so micrometers, so 25 micrometers. And you'll learn again when we do our lab this week, micro is 10 to the negative 6. So basically that's 0.000001. Okay, so actually this one is 0.000025. So it's very, 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 very small meters long. Okay, so very, very small, so micrometers. So scientists believe that these microorganisms were the first forms of life, and that they existed billions of years ago, and that they existed in the oceans. And so, studying biology can be at the microscopic level. So, this is where we think life began, is in the oceans. Okay, and so we're going to look at both biology at a microscopic level as well as a macroscopic level. Okay, so we're going to get into the process of science. And as far as the process of science goes, science comes about by just, for us wondering what is happening with things around us. Okay, so it comes from us wanting to know about our surrounding environments. So science is just knowledge. So it covers the general truths or the operation of general laws, especially when acquired and tested by the scientific method. Okay, so we are always wanting to know why something is the way it is. Okay, so we want to know why the sky is blue. We want to know why the leaves are green. We want to know why, we are sick, why a certain food might make us ill. So, why, what can we do to make us feel better when we get sick? So we're always on this constant drive for knowledge. And so the way we can try to gather that knowledge is through a process known as the scientific method. So the scientific method is it's a series of steps that include experiments as well as careful observations. And we're actually going to go through the scientific method in detail in this lecture, but you're also going to get practice this week in our lab. So before we get into the scientific method, one major piece of science is that we make hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an event, and the key point of hypothesis is that we can test it. So for example, if we notice something in our environment that we want to know more about, we're going to suggest an explanation for it, and then we'll go ahead and test it. Okay, so you might notice that the leaves are green, so then you come up with a plausible explanation for that, and then you test to see if your explanation is, has data that can support it or reject it. So that is a hypothesis. Now this is different from a theory. So a theory is a tested and confirmed explanation for observations or phenomena. So whereas a hypothesis is just a suggested explanation for a single event that can be tested, a theory is very broad in scope. So it's something that's been confirmed and tested over and over and over and over again with varied evidence. So, whereas if I, look at a leaf and say that the reason why it's green is because it has chlorophyll that absorbs green wavelengths of light. So I can test that. I can, look at the chlorophyll and I can look and see the wavelengths of light that it absorbs. So that's very narrow in scope. But a theory is very broad in scope. I can't just, consider that a theory. So think of, a scientific theory that you've heard about. So you might come up with, for example, the theory of gravity. So you are proving that every day because you're not floating out into space, right? Hopefully you're not. So you are proving that by not floating away, and neither is your desk, and neither is your pencil, and neither is your dog. Okay, so you're proving that every day. Other theories, like in this class, we're going to learn about cell theory. So cell theory is the theory that every living thing is made of cells, and all cells are made from pre-existing cells. So we've never come across a living thing that's not made of a cell, and we've never seen a cell just poof out of nowhere and come from nothing. You've also maybe heard of the theory of natural selection, or the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, or perhaps germ theory, or there's a number of different theories out there. So those are all, scientific explanations that have been tested and confirmed over and over and over again. Okay, so a hypothesis is just a suggested explanation for a single event that we can test. A theory has been tested and confirmed over and over and over again. Okay. All right, so let's get into natural sciences. So, of course, biology is an example of a field of science, of natural science. So, it's considered a life science. Within natural sciences, there's also physical sciences. So those are, basically sciences that deal with, the natural world phenomena and processes. So that would be, if we take a look over here, there's a number of fields that fall in natural sciences. Okay, so that would be astronomy, okay, biology, geology, physics, chemistry, okay, mathematics. Those are all fields of natural sciences. Some fields are not considered natural sciences. For example, computer science is not a natural science because, well, we built a computer. So that's not considered a natural science. So natural sciences, since we're dealing with biology, that's considered a life science that falls in that realm. Okay. So when we're studying biology, we're restricted in that being a science, we're restricted to natural explanations for phenomena. So, we're only teaching things that are related to science. We're not going to be teaching supernatural explanations alongside it, okay? So we can't teach like belief systems. We can't, talk about the existence of God because we can't prove or disprove that through science. I mean, that doesn't mean that, science, we simply can't tell you if that's right or wrong for us to, tell you if there's a God or not, because science can't simply, provide data to support or reject that. Same with whether, which president would make the best, person, which person would be the best president. Okay, science can't tell us that. You have to go with, what your own morals and ethics and what you know about the system. So science can't, make you decide which one's the best choice. So you have to make it based on your own, personal beliefs. So science, we can only collect data, and based on that data, that can give you, whether you accept or reject a hypothesis. So we're limited in that regard to those natural explanations, okay? So don't expect us to go into anything else other than the natural explanations. All right, so let's get into scientific reasoning, okay? So we have two types of reasoning. We have something called inductive reasoning, and the other is deductive reasoning, okay? So let's start with the first one, inductive reasoning. So in inductive reasoning, you're going to draw a conclusion from a number of observations, okay? So you're going to basically be collecting information and then drawing a general conclusion from it. Okay, so here's an example. So we notice that there's members of a species that are not all the same. And then from that, we also observe that the individuals within that species are competing for resources. And we also see that the species are generally adapted to their environment. So these are just all these observations that we're noticing. So the individuals within the species don't all look alike. They're not all the same. They compete for the resources, and they're generally adapted to their environment. So based on those observations, we can conclude through inductive reasoning that the individuals most adapted to the environment are more likely to survive and pass their traits to the next generation. Okay? So that's called inductive reasoning. We're taking a number of observations and we're drawing a conclusion from that. Okay? And if this sounds familiar to you, this is called natural selection. Okay, so natural selection is basically this idea that Darwin, came up with, where, within a population, members of the population, there's variation. So, for example, if you within a population of squirrels living in your backyard, they'd all have some variation. They don't all look alike, and that variation is heritable, meaning that it's in their genetics, and then they're competing for resources. So the ones that have the better genes for that environment are the ones that are going to survive longer and pass on those genes to the next generation. The ones that don't have the best genetics for that particular environment, they're not going to survive as long, and so they'll die off. And so over time, you'll see more members with those good genes, the weaker members die off. So over time, the population will evolve to have the better characteristics. Okay, so that's inductive reasoning based on observations leading to a general conclusion. Okay. Now, the other type of reasoning is called deductive. So in deductive, you take a general premise and you apply it to a specific result. Okay, so it's kind of like you're coming up with, you already have a general idea, and then you're coming up with a prediction from it. So here's our general premise. Basically, we concluded that individuals most adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass their traits on to the next generation. So now I can take that general premise and I can predict that if average temperature in an ecosystem increases due to climate change, individuals better adapted to warmer temperature will outcompete those that are not. Okay? So you can see there's a difference here. So in deductive reasoning, I already, have a conclusion. I already know that, from what I already know from, inductive reasoning, that, survival of the fittest, individuals that are better adapted to their environment will more likely survive and pass their genes on to the next generation. So taking that, conclusion, I can make a prediction that if global warming is going to take place, that those already adapted to warmer temperatures will do better and outcompete those that are not. Okay, so deductive reasoning, I am taking what I already know and predicting the future. Inductive reasoning, I'm making observations and coming up with a conclusion. Okay. So in this particular example, I am taking the conclusion from my inductive reasoning, which becomes the premise of the next one. Okay, so I can actually, kind of flip-flop there. All right. All right, so let's come up with, let's kind of do a check for understanding. So this is called a visual connection question. So over on the right is our definitions of inductive and deductive reasoning in case you need them. So we're going to decide if each of the following is an example of an inductive or deductive reasoning. So the first one, all flying birds and insects have wings. Birds and insects flap their wings as they move through the air. Therefore, wings enable flight. Would that be an example of inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you, because these are observations. All flying birds and insects have wings. That's an observation. Birds and insects flap their wings as they move through the air. That's an observation. Therefore, wings enable flight. That's a conclusion. Okay, so that's an example of inductive reasoning. Let's try number 2. Insects generally survive mild winters better than harsh ones. Therefore, insects pests will become more problematic if global temperatures increase. Is that an example of inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning? If you chose deductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So we already have a general premise here. So we already know that insects generally survive mild winters better than harsh ones. Therefore, we predict that insect pests will become more problematic if global temperatures increase. So that's a deductive reasoning. Okay. Number 3, chromosomes, the carriers of DNA, are distributed evenly between the daughter cells during cell division. Therefore, each daughter cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. Is that an example of inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning? So if you said deductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So we basically have this conclusion. So chromosomes, the carriers of DNA, are distributed evenly between the daughter cells during cell division. Okay, so from there, we're predicting that each daughter cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. Okay, so we came from a conclusion, and then now we're predicting that based on that cell division, each cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. So that is deductive reasoning. And for our final question, animals as diverse as humans, insects, and wolves all exhibit social behavior. Therefore, social behavior must have an evolutionary advantage. Is that an example of inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So we're making an observation. Animals as diverse as humans, insects, and wolves all exhibit social behavior. So that is an observation. So these types of animals all exhibit social behavior. So then we come up with a conclusion that social behavior must have an evolutionary advantage. All right. So let's move on to the scientific method. So the scientific method we talked a little bit about already. So that is that series of steps that scientists can take to basically figure out, address something that they're curious about in the world around them. So it's actually a series of steps to answer a particular question. And it does involve that hypothesis that we talk about. So remember, a hypothesis is an explanation for an event, and it must be tested, right? So there's actually two parts to a hypothesis. So we already talked about it has to be testable. Okay, so hypothesis has to be testable, otherwise it's not a hypothesis. You can't, if it's not testable, then what can you do? Okay. And then the other part of it is it has to be falsifiable. So what does that word falsifiable mean? So that means that it needs to be it can be proven false. Okay, so you can't just have any wishy-washy or gray areas to your hypotheses. So for example, I can't say like the leaves are green because it reflects green light or blue light or maybe red light. Okay, because that's a little too wishy-washy, because which is it? Is it the green light? Is it the blue light? Is it red light? So, you can't do wishy-washy there. It has to be falsifiable, okay? So if I said green light, then that's falsifiable. It's either green light or something else, okay? It can't be, green light or blue light or red light. It has to be one or the other. So hypotheses must be testable and must be falsifiable, okay? So that's a big thing, okay? So let's take a look at the scientific method. So to start us out with the scientific method, we make an observation. Okay, so for example, you might notice that I always stick to my plants for some reason, because I have my desk faces my yard, so I always see my plants out there. So I might notice that some of my plants are growing faster than others. So then that might make me ask a question. So why do some plants grow faster than others? So then I form a hypothesis. Maybe fertilizer helps them grow faster. So then I come up with a prediction. So a prediction is going to it's a little different than a hypothesis because it predicts the outcome of the experiment, okay? So if my hypothesis is fertilizer helps plants grow faster, that is falsifiable because I can test, some plants that have fertilizer and some plants that don't get fertilizer. So if, the ones that don't get fertilizer grow just as fast as the ones that get fertilizer, then we know that the fertilizer had nothing to do with the growth. But I can make a prediction, and usually predictions, by the way, they're in an if-then format. So if I give fertilizer to plants, then they'll grow faster. If I don't give fertilizer to the plants, then they won't grow as fast, or something like that. So then I will come up with an experiment. And in this case, I could do a controlled experiment. So a controlled experiment means that I'm only changing, I'm trying to control for my variables. So a variable, by the way, is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. So I want to try to control for as many variables as possible. So I only want to have, maybe just one variable changing within my experiment, all the others controlled for. So in this case, I want to have a control group and an experimental group. So my control group is going to be the no group. So a control group is always the no group. It's the group that does not get the treatment. In this case, I'm testing fertilizer. So the control group is the group that does not get the fertilizer. So the experimental group is the one that does get the fertilizer. Okay, so I'll have one group of plants that get fertilizer, and I'll have another group that gets no fertilizer. Okay, and then everything else, I'll try to control for all other variables. So I'll try to use the same type of plants. I'll try to use the same pots, the same soil, the same amount of water, the same access to light. Everything else I'm trying to do exactly the same amongst the treatments. The only difference is the control group gets no fertilizer, the experimental group gets the manipulation, gets the fertilizer. Okay, so that is basically the experiment. And by the way, when you get into the lab, it talks about the independent variable versus the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the manipulating variable. So it's the one I'm deciding ahead of time is going to be different between my control group and my experimental group, which is the fertilizer. Okay, so one group gets fertilizer, one group gets nothing. So I'm testing whether fertilizer has an effect. And then my dependent variable depends whether the independent variable, was there. So whether the fertilizer was there. So in this case, I'm checking to see if growth is dependent on the fertilizer. So that's my dependent variable, is the growth rate. So I set up my experiment. I have my plants set up. I give half the plants the fertilizer, which is the experimental group. The other half get no fertilizer, the control group. And treatments groups receive the same amount of light, the same amount of water, same amount of sun, all that stuff. And then I let the time go by and check their growth rate and so forth. And then let's say after a month, I noticed that the fertilizer group grew faster than the control group. So that's when I have tested my experiment and I've analyze my results, and I find that the hypothesis is supported that fertilizer does cause them to grow faster. So then I can report my results. Okay, but if I see that the control group and the experimental group grew the same, then that means my hypothesis was not supported, and so I write that down and then I have to try again. Okay, so this is the scientific method. It's just a series of steps that I would take. Okay, in this case it was a controlled experiment. All right, so let's do this little visual connection here. We're going to match the statement with the step of the scientific method. So we got to figure out which one of these is the observation. So let's see, we have there is something wrong with the electrical outlet. If something's wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work when plugged in. My toaster doesn't toast my bread. I plug my coffee maker into the outlet. My coffee maker works. Why doesn't my toaster work? So which one of these sounds like an observation? If you said C, I would agree with you. My toaster doesn't toast my bread. So that sounds like an observation here. So next, we're going to try to find the question. Hint, it's the one with the question mark. Why doesn't my toaster work? Okay, so now we have to find the hypothesis. Which one do you think is the hypothesis? If you said A, I would agree with you. There is something wrong with the electrical outlet. Okay, and that is testable, right? And it's falsifiable. Okay, so we can test whether there's something wrong with the electrical outlet, and we can falsify it. You know, it could be falsifiable because maybe there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, so what's next? We got to come up with a prediction, and then again a hint. These predictions are if-then format. So if something is wrong with the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work when plugged in. Okay, so what's the experiment? I plug my coffee maker into the outlet. So what's the result? My coffee maker works. Okay, so so that's the order. Okay, so observation, my toaster doesn't toast my bread. F, why doesn't my toaster work? Hypothesis, there is something wrong with the electrical outlet. If something is wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work. Experiment, I plug my coffee maker into the outlet. Result, my coffee maker works. Okay, so in this case it had nothing, so this one was rejected, the hypothesis was rejected. It wasn't the electrical outlet, it was the toaster. Okay. All right, so now let's get into basic versus applied sciences. So there's, you know, we already talked about deductive and inductive reasoning and, you know, the types of, you know, natural sciences and life sciences versus physical sciences. Now we're just going to go just talk about broadly basic versus applied sciences. Now, basic science is also known as pure science. So this is when we just seek to expand knowledge regardless of short-term application of that knowledge, okay? So for example, this is what a lot of academics do. So for example, when I was a master's, in my master's program, I studied hummingbird song. There was no real like demand for, you know, everybody, we have to go out there and learn about, you know, this hummingbird and why it sings right this second for, you know, humanity's sake, right? We just, that was something that we're curious about, and we wanted to know, you know, the evolution of song in hummingbirds, and, you know, especially since they, with male hummingbirds, the males have no, no part of upbringing of the babies, so how do little, you know, boy hummingbirds learn how to sing, because their mommies don't sing, so how do they figure it out? So, you know, that was just something we were curious about, and so that's, you know, what I did my master's thesis on. So that was just basic pure science. Okay, so basic science is just pure science, there to seek and expand knowledge regardless of any short-term application of that knowledge. Applied science aims to use science to solve immediate problems, okay? So for example, think back to COVID and remember how there was a race to find a vaccine for COVID, okay? So, you know, we had this horrible virus that was, you know, killing people left and right. making people horribly sick. The ER and hospitals were just overrun, and it was a horrible time in everybody's life, and so we needed a vaccination as quickly as possible. And so that was an example of applied science, using science to solve an immediate problem. Okay, these two can work together. Okay, so in order for us to get a vaccination on the market as quickly as we could, we also had to have basic science already there, to have a foundation. Okay, so we already needed to have some sense of how to create an RNA vaccination, right? To build off of, so that we could get the Pfizer vaccination and the Moderna vaccination already in production, or something similar to it up and running. Okay, so you can see how it might be cool just to focus in on applied science and just focus on that to solve every single problem, but you can't always do that. You have to have a foundation to build on. Okay, so in order for us to get a COVID vaccination to market as quickly as we could, we needed the basic science there already as that foundation. We already, we needed to know what an RNA virus was. We already needed to have some sort of understanding of how to create an RNA vaccination, and to be able to manipulate something like that to create one that could work so well with this coronavirus. Okay, so that's just the difference between the two. All right. And then finally we have the process of science. So going back, do you remember in our scientific method, you go down here with the hypothesis is supported or not supported, you report the results. So typically, if this was any scientific discovery that you made, and you're going to go ahead and publish it in a scientific journal, it first needs to go through a process of peer review. So scientific progress is typically made through the publication of peer-reviewed literature. Now this is a very complicated, lengthy process, where if you thought that I am a tough grader, you haven't seen anything yet. When you talk to these people who peer review for scientific journals, they are nitpicky people. It basically involves a blind process where scientists in your particular field, they look at the details of your particular experiment and your results and your interpretations, and they review every single detail of it. So they look at all of your raw data, they look at any resources that you cited, they look at the entire process, including anything that you submitted, as well as any notes that you had, and they're just making sure that everything that you did is accurate as possible. So they don't want anything to be missed. They don't want anything that was published that could be later debunked, basically. And so so basically experts in the same field as you will really carefully take a look at it and verify everything. So they even look at every single resource that you cited and make sure that everything's correct. And so usually it takes a couple of rough drafts going back and forth, even to with a chance that it could be rejected at the end. Okay, so it's a pretty lengthy process to get something published, and so when it does get published, it's pretty significant. And even when it does get published, it could eventually get retracted if later on somebody does a similar experiment and finds that your data does not match up with theirs, and maybe they found something that is of error to yours. So peer review is something that we do to just make sure that everybody's on the up and up. Okay. So when we do submit a paper for a scientific journal, or if you've ever looked at a scientific journal, The format is pretty standard, where we have an abstract, which is basically like a paragraph summarizing what the paper is all about. And then an introduction, which includes like all the background research, and then a methods section, which talks about how the experiment was conducted. A results section, which includes like just basically the information, what the data looks like, including visual representations of it, and then a discussion about, interpretations of the data and what it means, and then a literature cited section for all the resources that were used. All right, so we're going to end this video with some review questions. So these review questions are good to just make sure that we understand everything. Okay. The first forms of life on Earth were they plants, microorganisms, birds, or dinosaurs? If you chose microorganisms, I would agree with you. So remember at the beginning of the video, I talked about those, 25 micrometer long little itty bitty microscopic organisms. They were the first organisms. A suggested and testable explanation for an event is called a hypothesis, a variable, a theory, or a control. If you chose a hypothesis, I would agree with you. So remember, a hypothesis must be testable and also falsifiable. The review question is so light there. Which of the following sciences is not considered a natural science? Would it be biology, astronomy, physics, or computer science? Of course, computer sciences. Computers don't grow on trees, so that is not the natural one. Next one, a type of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion is called, was that deductive reasoning, the scientific method, hypothesis-based science, or inductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So remember, inductive reasoning, you take observations to lead you to a general conclusion. Deductive is the opposite. You have a general conclusion or premise that allows you to predict results. The process of blank helps to ensure that a scientist's research is original, significant, logical, and thorough. What is that process? A process of publication, a process of public speaking, a process of peer review, or the process of scientific method? If you chose peer review, I would agree with you. And our final question. A person notices that her houseplants that are regularly exposed to music seem to grow more quickly than those in rooms with no music. As a result, she determines that plants grow better when exposed to music. This example most closely resembles which type of reasoning? Is it inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, neither because no hypothesis was made, or both inductive and deductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So in this case, we have an observation. She notices that her houseplants regularly exposed to music seem to grow more quickly than those in rooms with no music at all. So then she comes to the conclusion that plants grow better when exposed to music. So we are done with the first section of Chapter 1, the Introduction to Biology. So by now, you should be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences, as well as summarize the steps of the scientific method. You should be able to compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning, as well as describe the goals of basic science and applied science. Okay. So for my next video, I'm going to get into 1.2, which covers the themes and concepts of biology.